You have carried the weight of worlds that were never yours to hold, and somewhere deep in the architecture of your psyche, something has begun to collapse. Not with drama, not with the theater of a breakdown, but with the quiet finality of a door closing in an empty house. Jung encountered this phenomenon repeatedly in his practice, and it unsettled him profoundly because what he witnessed defied every category of diagnosis he had learned. His most empathic patients, the ones who had spent years absorbing the emotional atmospheres of everyone around them, would arrive one day transformed by an absence so complete it resembled death itself. Yet they were not depressed. They were not broken. They had simply stopped. And in that stopping, something ancient and necessary had begun. This is not the exhaustion you recover from with rest. This is not the burnout that a vacation can remedy. What Jung observed was a fundamental reorganization of the psyche's relationship to the world, a severing so profound that it looked from the outside like the person had gone cold, had lost their humanity, had become unreachable. Family members would report with genuine distress that their loved one no longer seemed to care. Friends would describe a sudden and inexplicable distance. Partners would feel as though they were living with a stranger. And the empath themselves would sit in Jung's consulting room and say with an eerie calm that frightened even them, "I just don't feel anything anymore. Not anger, not sadness, not even the desire to explain. Just nothing." Jung's initial response was to treat this as pathology, as a defensive numbing against overwhelming affect. But the longer he observed, the more he realized he was witnessing something else entirely. This was not dissociation. This was discrimination. The psyche, after years of indiscriminate outward flow, had finally initiated its own compensation, pulling back the libido that had been hemorrhaging into the collective field, redirecting it inward toward the self that had been neglected, abandoned, sacrificed at the altar of others' needs. What looked like coldness was actually the first movement toward wholeness. What appeared as withdrawal was the psyche's desperate attempt to survive its own generosity. You must understand what led to this moment, because it did not arrive suddenly. The empath's nervous system has functioned since childhood as an emotional receptor, tuned to frequencies others cannot detect. You walk into a room and within seconds you know who is angry, who is hurt, who is lying, who is afraid. You absorb these atmospheres automatically, involuntarily, the way lungs absorb air. There is no off switch. There is no filter. The emotional weather of every environment you enter becomes your internal weather, and you have learned to navigate the world by managing not your own feelings, but the feelings of everyone around you. In family systems, you became the emotional regulator, the one who sensed tension before it erupted and moved to diffuse it, who carried the unspoken grief of a parent, who absorbed the rage no one else would acknowledge. In friendships, you were the perpetual mediator, holding space for everyone's pain, offering understanding even when you received none in return. In romantic relationships, you disappeared entirely, your own needs evaporating in the face of your partner's distress, your identity becoming a mirror for their emotional landscape. And the cost of this, the invisible cost that no one calculated, was the slow depletion of your own life force, the gradual erosion of the boundary between self and other, until you could no longer distinguish your feelings from the feelings you had absorbed. Jung identified 3 distinct stages that precede the final letting go, and if you are honest, you will recognize yourself in this progression. The first stage he called the martyr phase, where you believed your sensitivity was your purpose, your gift, your sacred duty. You told yourself that your ability to feel deeply was what made you valuable, that your capacity to hold space for others' suffering was a spiritual calling. You wore your empathy like a badge of honor, and secretly, unconsciously, you derived your sense of worth from being needed. The exhaustion you felt was reframed as noble sacrifice. The depletion was proof of your compassion, and anyone who suggested you were giving too much was dismissed as not understanding the depth of your calling. But the psyche cannot sustain this fiction indefinitely. The second stage arrives when the body begins to rebel, when migraines and fatigue and inexplicable illness force you to confront the unsustainability of your patterns. Jung called this the bargaining phase, where you attempt to set boundaries, while maintaining the same fundamental dynamic. You read books about self-care, you practice saying no, you establish limits that you immediately violate because the guilt of disappointing others feels more unbearable than your own suffering. You negotiate with your nervous system, promising to rest later, to take care of yourself once everyone else is okay, once this crisis passes, once things calm down. But things never calm down because your very presence signals to others that you are available to carry what they cannot. The third stage is the collapse, and it is here that Jung's patients would arrive in his office, bewildered by their own inability to continue. This is not a decision. This is the psyche's emergency shutdown, the moment when the unconscious intervenes because consciousness refused to. You find yourself unable to muster the energy to care, unable to generate the empathy that once flowed so freely, unable to perform the emotional labor that defined your identity. And this terrifies you because without your empathy, who are you? If you are not the one who understands, who holds, who heals, what is your value? What is your place in the world? Jung's diagnosis cut to the bone. He recognized that empathy, when unconscious, becomes a defense mechanism against individuation. By focusing relentlessly on others, you avoid the confrontation with your own shadow, your own unlived life, your own rejected aspects. By merging with others' emotional states, you escape the loneliness of your own separate existence. And the collective unconscious, that vast field of shared psychic patterns, makes an unconscious demand on certain individuals to carry the emotions the collective refuses to feel. You become the repository for the grief, the rage, the fear that others cannot tolerate. And society, which benefits from your service, will punish you viciously when you withdraw it, will call you selfish, cold, cruel, will accuse you of betrayal for the crime of choosing yourself. The projection trap is perhaps the most insidious mechanism Jung identified. Others project onto you the parts of themselves they have rejected, their vulnerability, their need, their helplessness, and you, in your empathic resonance, absorb these projections and carry them as though they were your own. You become the container for everyone's disowned shadows, and over time you lose track of what belongs to you and what you have taken on. Your psyche becomes a storage facility for others' psychological refuse, and the weight of it slowly crushes the life out of you. What dies in the letting go is not your capacity to feel. What dies is the false identity built on being needed. The addiction to emotional fusion, the savior complex disguised as compassion, the unconscious agreement to carry what was never yours. And this death, though it feels like annihilation, is the necessary precondition for something true to be born. The final letting go that Jung documented is not detachment in the way most people understand it. It is discrimination. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else you will learn about this process. When Jung first encountered empaths in this stage, he made careful notes about what he called the psyche's natural compensation. He observed that after years of outward emotional flow, after decades of pouring libido into others' wounds, something in the unconscious rises up and says enough. Not with words, not with anger, with silence. With a kind of internal closing that feels to the empath like death itself. But Jung recognized this as the psyche protecting itself from complete dissolution. You must understand what is actually happening here. The withdrawal is not coldness, it is psychological necessity. Your nervous system, after years of absorbing others' emotional states, reaches a saturation point. The container is full, there is no more room. And if you continue trying to take in more, you will fragment. You will lose the coherence of your own psyche. So the unconscious intervenes. It pulls back the bridges. It raises the drawbridge. It says to the world, no more. Not because you have stopped loving, but because continuing to love in the same way will destroy you. Jung distinguished carefully between empathy and emotional enmeshment, and this distinction is what most people miss entirely. Empathy is the capacity to feel with another while maintaining your own psychological boundaries. Enmeshment is the dissolution of those boundaries, the merging of your emotional body with another's to the point where you cannot tell whose feelings are whose. What the empath has been calling empathy for most of their life is actually enmeshment. And enmeshment, Jung discovered, is not love. It is unconscious fusion born from an inability to tolerate separateness. When you finally let go, you are not becoming cold. You are becoming boundaried. You are not losing your capacity for compassion. You are ending your compulsion toward emotional fusion. And the world will call this cruelty because the world has been feeding on your lack of boundaries for years. The people around you have built their psychological equilibrium on your willingness to absorb what they cannot hold. When you stop, their entire system destabilizes, and they will blame you for it. They will call you selfish. They will say you have changed, that you are no longer the person they knew, and they will be right. You are no longer the person who abandons themselves to maintain others' comfort. Stop watching. Go to the comments and write, "I see my shadow," no more, no less. This is the first step. Writing it makes it real. Now let's continue. Jung identified 3 sacred releases that mark this final phase of awakening. These are not intellectual decisions. They are deep psychic shifts that happen when the self can no longer tolerate the false position the ego has maintained. The first release is the need to save. For years you have operated under the unconscious belief that others cannot carry their own psychological weight, that without your intervention they will collapse, that your empathy is what keeps them alive. This belief, Jung understood, is grandiose. It positions you as the savior and them as the helpless. It denies their own capacity for growth, their own relationship with suffering, their own journey toward wholeness. When you release the need to save, you are not abandoning anyone. You are returning to them their own psychological burden, which is the only thing that will make them strong. This release feels like betrayal. It feels like you are watching someone drown and choosing not to throw the rope. But Jung would tell you that what you have been calling drowning is often just discomfort. It is the natural struggle of a psyche trying to grow. And by constantly intervening, by constantly absorbing their pain, you have prevented the very transformation they need. Your empathy has become their prison. Your care has become their weakness. And letting go is the most loving thing you can do, even though it will feel like violence. The second release is the need to be understood. This one cuts even deeper because it touches the empath's core wound. You have spent your entire life feeling misunderstood, sensing that you perceive realities others cannot see, carrying knowledge about emotional undercurrents that no one else acknowledges. And because of this, you have desperately wanted someone to finally see you, to recognize the depth of what you carry, to validate the truth of your experience. But Jung discovered that this need for understanding is itself a projection. You are asking others to give you what you have not given yourself. You are demanding that they see you when you have not fully seen yourself. When you release the need to be understood, you withdraw your projections. You stop expecting others to meet needs they are not equipped to meet. You stop performing your pain in hopes that someone will finally recognize it. And in that withdrawal, something extraordinary happens. You become free. Free from the exhausting cycle of explaining yourself, justifying your sensitivity, trying to make others comprehend what they are not meant to comprehend. You realize that being understood by others was never the point. The point was understanding yourself. And that work, Jung insisted, can only be done in solitude. The third release is the need to remain connected. This is the most terrifying release because it threatens the empath's entire identity structure. You have built your sense of self on your ability to maintain connection, to bridge distances, to hold relationships together through sheer force of emotional labor. The thought of letting connections dissolve, of allowing relationships to end, of choosing solitude over belonging, feels like annihilation. But Jung understood this release as essential to individuation. There comes a point in psychological development where you must choose between remaining connected to the collective and becoming who you actually are. And for the empath, that choice is particularly brutal because connection has been your religion. When you release the need to remain connected, you are honoring what Jung called the solitude required for individuation. You are acknowledging that the final stages of psychological development cannot happen in relationship. They require withdrawal. They require a descent into your own depths that no one else can accompany you through. And this does not mean you will never have relationships again. It means the relationships you have will be fundamentally different because they will be chosen from wholeness rather than needed from emptiness. These three releases constitute what Jung called the death of the provisional personality. Everything you thought you were, everything you built your identity on, everything that gave you value in the eyes of others, dies. And for a time, there is nothing to replace it. You stand in a void. You are not who you were, but you are not yet who you are becoming. Jung called this the nigredo, the blackening, the stage of alchemical transformation, where the old form must completely decompose before the new form can emerge. And it is in this void that the real work happens. The alchemy of transformation that Jung documented is a process of reclaiming libido from external projections. For years, your life force has been scattered across dozens of people, poured into their needs, their wounds, their growth. Your energy has been everywhere but in you. The letting go initiates a return. The psychic energy you invested outward begins flowing back to its source. And as it returns, you feel it. You feel yourself becoming more solid, more present, more real. Not because you are gaining something new, but because you are recovering what was always yours. Jung observed that this return of energy creates what looks from the outside like selfishness. The empath who once gave endlessly suddenly has nothing to give. They cancel plans. They stop responding to messages. They disappear from social obligations. And people are shocked. They are hurt. They accuse the empath of changing, of becoming cold, of abandoning them. But what is actually happening is that the empath is finally investing in their own psychological development. They are finally using their energy for individuation rather than for maintaining others' comfort. And this, Jung insisted, is not selfishness. It is maturation. As the energy returns to the self, something begins to stabilize. The chaos of absorbed emotions starts to settle. The constant overwhelm begins to quiet. And in that quieting, you discover something you have never experienced before. Silence. Not the silence of numbness or dissociation, but the silence of a centered psyche. Your inner world is finally your own. The thoughts are yours. The feelings are yours. The impulses are yours. You are no longer a radio picking up everyone else's frequency. You are a coherent signal broadcasting from your own center. This is when the real transformation becomes visible. Silence, which once felt like death, becomes power. Not power over others, but power within yourself. You realize that you do not need to respond to every emotional bid, do not need to fix every problem, do not need to maintain every connection. You can simply be. And in that being, without the compulsive doing, you discover who you actually are beneath all the roles you have played.